are ready to begin. Good afternoon, everybody. We have another wonderful crowd. Welcome to the 251st meeting of the Lexington Veterans Association. I'm Linda Dixon, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you this afternoon. We have a wonderful program. You're going to be so glad you came. Let us start the meeting with a Pledge of Allegiance, led by Jack Ryan. Please rise.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Our thanks for the wonderful spread, the coffee. Thanks to Starbucks in Lexington Center once again for supplying the complimentary coffee. Thanks to everyone who provided the delicious baked goods so that we can have our social hour. And thanks for putting in your contributions in our basket and contributing to our operating fund. If anyone is here for the first time, would you just raise your hand? We'd like to just acknowledge you. Well, wonderful. This is great. Every session we have anywhere from 2 to 6 or 8 new guests. And we're always delighted to have new people come and join us. We hope this will not be your last time. We hope it will be the first time of many. We have several announcements we would like to have made. The first one, Rick Beyer, whom you remember, gave us 2 terrific presentations about the Ghost Army, has a quick update and an announcement he would like to make. Hello, Rick.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here again. I'm going to be extremely brief. Don't worry. Okay. You know about the Ghost Army. I told you about it. The World War II unit. They used inflatable tanks and trucks and artillery to fool the Germans on the battlefields of Europe. This inflatable tank right here, and maybe right there, the USA inflatable tank. And we have just started a Ghost Army nonprofit called the Ghost Army Legacy Project, which is to honor and preserve the legacy of this unit that conducted 21 different deception missions during World War II. We're building a Ghost Army archive. We are working with museums to do a Ghost Army exhibit. I'm meeting with the Spy Museum next week. And we are also trying to do some educational outreach to teach more people about this. This actual photo here, and some of the ones I have at my feet, are photos that we just acquired. It was a collection that we bought. It was being sold by a collector. It would have disappeared into a private collection, but we've bought it, and we are cataloging it. We will eventually be making it available to researchers and students and other people interested in this. So I wanted to let you know about the Ghost Army Legacy Project, and we have on the side table, I've got a bunch of one-sheets, handouts here. I'd certainly like to encourage you to take one of these. If you're interested, we would love you to donate, of course. There's always that, right, to the nonprofit. But even if you're not interested in that, we'd love to hear from you, put you on our mailing list, our email list, so that we can keep you informed about it. Because I think that this is something I feel very importantly about. I've been working on this for 12 years, and I'm really determined that we do everything we can to remember this fantastic, amazing story of these men who made a very unique contribution to World War II. So I just wanted to let you know about that. Please come and take one of the handouts on the side afterwards. And Linda, that's it. I said I would do it in under 2 minutes, and I succeeded. Thank you very much.
Wonderful project. Gina, where are you? Gina Rada, our Veterans Services Officer, has a Veterans update.
Hi. So the other day I was at a meeting and someone mentioned that they had just been to the RMV, and the person that was taking care of them asked them if they were a veteran. I don't know, some of you may already know this, but you can have veteran now written on your license. So we thought it was a good piece of information to make sure that all of you knew. It doesn't cost anything. They will write veteran at the bottom of your license, but you have to bring a copy of your DD 214 to the RMV in order for them to do that. So for those of you who use the VA healthcare system, you might get those VA veteran identification cards, and you would know that you get a 10% discount at Home Depot and Lowe's if you show them your VA card. So if you don't use the VA healthcare system, then you think, well, I don't have one of those cards, so I can't get it. Well, this is the way around it. So you can go to the RMV, you can have a new license printed, you'll put veteran on your license, and then you can use that to get your veterans discounts at various places that offer them. So I thought I'd let everybody know it's free. That's something separate than getting your veterans license plates, which obviously there's an additional cost depending on what license plate you want to get. But the license itself, the card, you can have veteran put on it for free. Just make sure you bring your DD 214 to the RMV. And if you don't have your DD 214, you can come to my office and I will help you get a copy of your DD 214. That is it.
We thought that was worth knowing about. Well, we sent a quick email reminding everybody that there was still time to bring in magazines and calendars for the veterans, and boy, have you responded. That table is full. Thank you so much. Yes, sir,
A
John.
number of people have asked me whether or not they can drop them off at the library if they're not here for one of our meetings. Will the library accept them?
It's a wonderful question. We'll find out. I would think the answer is probably yes. No, Warren says no.
I doubt it. They'd get inundated.
Okay.
I don't know. I mean, that's no authority, but I wouldn't be surprised if they.
Maybe I'm being naive. We'll find out. Okay. But thank you all. I'm going to fill my trunk with everything that you brought today, but that's what they asked for, and we're going to give it to them. Thank you so much. Finally, Professor Bob Allison, who's a professor of history at Suffolk University, has spoken to us 2 or 3 times, and he's just wonderful. He talks about the American Revolution. You might remember him. He's going to be with us later this year. Sent us an email. One of his senior history students is doing a project for his senior graduation project. He's interviewing World War II veterans as part of an oral history project, and he's hopefully looking for a few more World War II veterans who would be willing just to sit down with him and have a conversation. He lives in Arlington. He'd be very willing to come to you, and it's not very taxing. He would just, something has just happened. He'd be happy to just sit, ask you questions, listen, and tape record your story. Professor Allison sat in with the student during one such interview and vouches for him and said he did a very good job. If you or someone, you think you know someone who would be interested in participating in this, there's a sign-up sheet on the table. It's called World War II Oral History Project. Would you just sign your name and some email address or some way we can get in touch with you, and we'll put you two together. It would be very, very much appreciated, and of course we think it's a fine idea. Finally, before we introduce our speaker, for those of you who are filling out surveys, would you please remember it's two-sided. So please fill out the back side as well. All right, thank you. Now let's get to work here. Many of you have met Dan Leclerc. He's been with us several times before. He's pretty much of an expert on World War I. But 6 months ago, he told us that he had a story in him that he wanted to get out. And he wanted to tell the story of Korea. And he felt that it was an untold story, that it just hadn't been told in the way he wanted to tell it. And we agreed that he was the one to tell that story. And he's been working on this program for at least 6 months. And here it is. It's in fruition today. And it's well worth the wait. Korea was a war that no one in America wanted, and America was in no position to fight. Nevertheless, when Kim Il-sung, the dictator in North Korea, supported by the Soviets, launched an offensive across the 38th parallel, on June 25, 1950, President Harry Truman saw no choice but to fight this blatant treaty violation. And America found itself once again at war. Our speaker, Dan Leclerc, as I mentioned, generally specializes in World War I, but not today. Korea is the story of a tragic war. And I believe we have some Korean War veterans with us today. Would you just raise your hand? One? Look at that. Dan, you brought them out. Wonderful. And you can tell us if these are Dan's words, really. You tell us if you're in agreement. Korea is the story of a tragic war in which American soldiers fought bravely and tenaciously with little training, inadequate weapons, and minimal understanding of Korean culture or fighting methods in searing heat and bone-chilling cold, sustaining large numbers of casualties, finally ending in an inconclusive and permanent ceasefire. Dan is a retired high school teacher and administrator. He was an infantry officer in the Massachusetts National Guard. For several years, he has taught courses with a focus on World War I to retired groups of alumni at Tufts University and UMass Boston, among others. He's made several trips to the Western Front, in France and Belgium, and he's an appointed member of the World War I Centennial Commission. So, please welcome Dan Leclerc.
Thank you very much, Linda. Before I get started, I want to thank Linda for what she's doing. We really appreciate her work in keeping this organization. I do speaking engagements all over the state. And there's certain towns, I won't say their name because it wouldn't be nice for them to hear me say that. But you know in Boston, when the theaters used to come to Boston first, right? To get they come here to sort of get their thing organized and test their methods. And then if they're really good, they go to New York, all right? Well, I won't tell you what some of those places I went to visit, and I'm glad I did a couple of times. But now I'm in Broadway. This is it. This organization, this Veteran Society, is arguably the most sophisticated, best group who come on their own volition to learn about all aspects of military history and military life. So being here is really an honor. To me, it's like the top of the game. So I'm very proud and happy to be here. All right. The other thing I want to mention is, listen, I'm sorry that it was like 15 degrees when you came here today, but don't sweat it, because at Chosin Reservoir, as Mr. Griffiths has just told me, he was a veteran, he's been there. When he was there, it was 40 below zero. So no complaining. Thank you, Dick. Where were you? This is really interesting.
At the end of the chosen reservoir, we were up there and we did get it recorded that it was 30 below normal, 40 below only once that I remember. But unfortunately, we had no place to go. Once the lights went out or it got dark, you had no place to go but take it. You couldn't dig a hole, it was frozen, everything was frozen. But we were up at UDMD, which is the end of the reservoir, and that was a disaster. I wish I had never gone to Korea, and I would suggest to anybody who has a free invite to North Korea, don't go.
Well, okay, that's a good point. I appreciate that, but I want to, in a friendly way, take that in a different direction. That's why I have the slide here. What do you think this is? Anybody?
Modern Seoul. Well, it looks like a modern city someplace. I don't know.
Yes.
It certainly don't look like Korea.
What? No.
Is that Seoul?
Busan.
Busan.
That's Busan Harbor, which was a small little harbor at the very southern end of the Korean peninsula, which we retreated to. That's it today. It's a modern, vibrant, energetic city. Now, I'm going to say this with a purpose, a little bit of patriotism. I don't want to push that too far, but listen, why do you think that city's there and it's like that?
Americans.
Of course, it's the way we handle in our better days when we go back to places where we fought. This is a lot of American industry here, a lot of jobs, a lot of technology, compared to what's happening north with this fine gentleman here. Okay, now Kim Il-un. Now, what we see is a dramatic difference in the culture. While the South is booming, making automobiles, Kias, Hyundais, tremendous business. Same thing with Seoul is similar to that. It's an economic engine. It's a powerful trade partner to this country. We have a deep interest in this whole phenomenon, but we also have some issues we need to worry about some possible outcomes of some tensions that are going on right now. All right? So for example, using IMF, International Monetary Fund information, the per capita income in North Korea is $1,800. You don't make too much of a living on $1,800. South Korea, $34,400. That's approaching the American per capita income. This is a vibrant, powerful economy. People don't realize that. People come to this place and they think it's, I show this slide and they think, oh, that's Singapore, that's Tokyo, the big modern cities. No, it's South Korea, it's Busan. Get that, keep that in your head. It's important to understand, to put a better edge on this, that this is one of the good outcomes. A lot of bad outcomes, but this is one of the good ones, our partnership with this country. All right? But right now, we're sitting in a very tense situation. And it's why I thought I wanted to do this talk right now. It's the right time to do it. With nuclear testing, this North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, asserts the role of an instigator. He's trying to punch holes in people. He's trying to get attention. We don't know what motivates all of that. Some of it could be foreign policy, some of it could be personal pique, could be any number of psychological issues. We don't understand it. But he is now on the verge or has already established a medium-range nuclear capacity. He does have nuclear warheads, but it's a question of can he deliver them. But it appears that recent tests suggest that he has medium-range capacity. He could, for example, easily hit, we have 28,000 soldiers, US soldiers in the DMZ in Korea, who are a perfect target if he wants to be an instigator for whatever reason he has. We have 50,000 American soldiers in Japan, which are within the medium-range capacity. Also, Guam is within the range of a medium nuclear weapon from Korea, North Korea. That would be he would love to do that. Wipe out Guam, big publicity issue. Hard to know what motivates him to do that. What I'm suggesting is that if any one of those things happens, we have some hard decisions to make. as a nation. There's going to be, I believe, a huge amount of pressure on the president-elect, or will be hopefully be president by then, to respond in some way. I don't have an opinion or an idea about that, but I think it's relevant now, and I think it's useful to have some understanding of what came before all of this. Okay? And also, President Park, who's our partner, who is the democratically elected leader, is now under impeachment and will most likely be removed from office, which is very destabilizing for a very important friendly democracy. And people have been saying, our foreign policy experts are suggesting, I don't have a lot of hard information on this, but that there's a group in the wings who are prepared to move in, who apparently have ties to China. I don't know if that's a rumor, I can't back that up, but I've heard some experts say, well, be careful, gotta watch what's going on here, because whenever a vacuum is created, a vacuum is filled. And you never quite know what that vacuum is going to be. So I just want to put that out there as a matter of significant concern. Here's a visual way for me to explain the difference between South Korea and North Korea. All right? Here's North Korea. It's now midnight. It is totally dark except for a little area in Pyongyang, which is the capital. The rest of the country is dark, mostly because they don't have rural electrification. They don't have any kind of developments. They don't have a lot of shopping malls, parking lots. It's a simple indication. This is South Korea at midnight, lit up. You know, when you fly from New York to Boston, coming into Logan, and you look out the window, you see one community after another lit up, no matter how late at night. It's how we live. It's the American way. What it tells you is the degree of development, the dramatic degree of development that exists between both nations. So what we're seeing here is a hermit nation's been out of touch with the rest of the world, under a leadership who doesn't have to explain anything, doesn't have to produce anything for its ordinary people, can serve its own political purposes. I think this is probably the most powerful piece of evidence that there is. Also, I want to talk about temperature a little bit. Korea is a very rugged country. Most of Korea, as you know, is mountainous. There's not a lot of, it's not the plains of France and Normandy. Vast hundreds of miles of lush agricultural land. It's very heavily mountainous. It's hard to travel. Not a lot of big highways because you can't get around. And that's what made the fighting so difficult. In fact, it was not often when you were on level land, was there? You were always climbing or going down.
South Korea, 5%.
So here are the temperature ranges between each country. It's very, very cold in the winter. You just heard from Mr. Griffiths, 40 degrees below zero in the winter in the upper Pusan, the Chosin Reservoir. And in the summer, it's extremely hot. So it's intemperate both ends and very difficult to get around. A tough country to live in and to fight in. So I want to lay that out right away. Traveling, going from one place to another is not easy. Normal, and part of the problem we ran into as American soldiers is our difficulty in adjusting. Remember now, a lot of World War II was fought, for example, in the plains of France, right? Or Western Germany. Our military strategies are often based on the assumption of fairly flat land where you can maneuver and enfilade and defilade and all those things you do in warfare don't work well in the mountains. All that training you get at Fort Dix, New Jersey doesn't work in the mountains of Korea. It's a whole different, it's much more asymmetric. A lot like it was right here in this town in 1787, on April 19th, coming back from Concord. Asymmetric warfare, fought from both sides of the winding paths. Again, not, because the British were annoyed by that. They don't play by the rules. They're not sporting. They hide behind trees and stone fences, take shots at us, but don't stay there waiting us to fire back. They move. How inconsiderate of them to keep on moving like that. Make moving targets. They don't understand the rules of the game. So that's kind of what you're dealing with here in Korea, an enormous amount of asymmetric warfare that was very difficult for Americans to adjust to. Now, I want to talk about the issue of prejudice. Prejudice exists in all forms in all places, but it's particularly difficult in Korea. According to the Korean people, were occupied and colonized by the Japanese in 1910. Remember, who won the Russo-Japanese War? Anybody? Japanese won the Russo-Japanese War. Nobody saw that coming. That was one of the biggest historic shocks ever, because the West always dominated. It was always France, England, Germany, Italy. Always it was the West who were the dominant colonial empires that would expand and progress. All of a sudden, Asian, Oriental nation beats a Western country. Remember, Russia is a Western country, part of the Western sphere. And people, that rolled across and it was a huge shock. And it changed forever the military and economic equilibrium of the globe. Japan won that war. Japan all of a sudden is a player. Japan gets to go into Korea and literally take it over. The Japanese were not very nice to the South Koreans, or all the Koreans. They saw the Koreans as a lesser people, a people with not much intelligence and capacity and strength and culture. They were treated like slaves. They were egregiously harsh to the Japanese, to the Koreans, the North and South Koreans. But I wish they were here now. I wish I could confront the Japanese leaders who treated the Koreans the way they did, because I could say, can you imagine, right here, can you imagine someday, okay, we're back. Can you imagine someday seeing this in South Korea? They could never imagine that ever, that a South Korean country could ever be so progressive and so successful and so enlightened and so technologically proficient. This is the problem, that we have a people who are colonizing this people who assume that they have very little human intellectual and spiritual capacity. So underneath this whole thing is that problem, and it shows up in very unfortunate, and in some ways for us Americans, embarrassing ways. Okay, moving on. All right, during the period of the first Governor General of Korea was Kanyaki Koso. At the same time, Joseph Stalin was the leader of the Russians. And there had been an agreement after the war that the Japanese would be given control of this area, but then after the war, they had to leave. Because remember, Japan was an enemy. They lost the war. So they were basically asked to leave. And what was created in the Potsdam Conference, which Truman presided over, that Korea was sort of left there with, what are we going to do with it? Who's going to gain hegemony over parts of Korea or all of it? And the agreement was that the Soviet Union would get North Korea as it's not well defined. There's no legal term for it. Sphere of influence. That's kind of like the fudge word that they use in diplomacy. Well, it's their sphere of influence. It's their bureaucratic hegemony. We're not saying that they're there permanently. The agreement was we will give you some bureaucratic control over that part of Korea, and the Americans would get the South. But keep in mind that we agree here at Potsdam that the ultimate goal is for both sides to be given their freedom. That was the understanding at first at Yalta, as a matter of fact, but even with Roosevelt, then later more reinforced by Truman at Potsdam. So the assumption is both sides would help their given people who they now control freedom at some point, and generally speaking in the process of some kind of a democratic process. That was the assumption. So what emerged now were some leadership issues. North Korea was awarded, you might say, without asking permission, the leadership of Kim Il-sung. Now, Kim Il-sung is a very important person because he is a very highly trained person who fought with the Russians at Stalingrad. Highly trained, highly competent person, who was also deeply indoctrinated in the ideology of communism. So he became a communist leader, sort of a patron of the Russian system, of Russian communist politics. He comes in and he imposes upon North Korea a rigid, authoritarian, dictatorial regime, which is what he's seen in Russia from Lenin and from Stalin. That is his state of mind. It's what he imposes. And it's also what the North Koreans were used to, had been used to when they were under the Japanese. We, on the other hand, bring in a guy named Lieutenant John Hodge. Now, Lieutenant Hodge, I think I'm supposed to be in the next slide here. Oh, hold on, I'll wait. Lieutenant Hodge comes in, and he doesn't like the South Koreans. He doesn't like the way they smell. Koreans have a particular odor. It has to do with what they eat. It has to do with a nutritional issue, apparently. Now, you're saying no, so why don't you explain that? You're saying no, so I want to hear your position because I might be wrong.
Korea has special smell. Is that what you said?
A different smell.
Oh.
Not bad, not just, well, special.
I was just wondering if they are the only people who have smell or everybody has smell.
I'm asking you, I don't know. But apparently what General Hodge was saying is, not only are they different than us, they also smell different than them. It's a prejudice. It's a very superficial way of defining people.
That's what they eat.
Smelling, that's what they, strictly.
Probably smelling their cooking.
Yeah. When
Yeah.
you cook, yes.
Had to do with the food. But like, yes, you don't understand what I'm saying. But to use that as a criteria for deciding the level of civilization is ridiculous. It's not something we should be doing, especially as Americans.
No,
Okay.
I misunderstood you. I thought they smell Korean. And you smell Irish or you smell That's what I thought you meant.
All right, no.
And I cannot lose it.
I only mention it because it's the kind of thing that General Hodge would say. It's the kind of superficial attitude he has about the identity of the people who he is now in charge. He also just doesn't like the South Koreans. He doesn't respect them. He doesn't think they have any capacity. So what does he do? To give him some due, he's only given 500 troops to do this job with. He's got 500 troops that Washington gives him to basically run a country, which is absurd on the face of it. What it says is that we, the United States, we're not serious about what's going to happen to South Korea. We don't have a deeply vested interest in the future of that country. If all we do is send 500 people to run an entire nation, that's nuts. Okay? So he has an attitude problem, both reinforced by his commanders, but by his own particular attitudes, his racial attitudes. He has racial attitudes about the South Koreans. They're an inferior race. That's his attitude. So the only way to straighten them out, the only way to get them to function correctly, if I'm going to have this job, is what does he do? The worst thing you can do, the worst diplomacy I can imagine. Let's bring back a lot of thousands of former Japanese bureaucrats who ran the country before I came. All those people that abused the Koreans heretofore are now going to be brought back to run the country because they're the only people that can really get those South Koreans to function properly. Well, I would call that diplomatically insensitive. Not a demonstration of a sophisticated attitude. I don't think these guys went to Fletcher School of diplomacy. I don't think, because that's where you went, right? No, you wouldn't put up with that. I'm just trying to get the idea. We send the wrong person in the wrong place at the wrong time. So in a sense, we make these kind of self-inflicted wounds. It's too bad. So here's how we start. In the meantime, the Soviet Union did, for several years, train the soldiers, the Korean soldiers who were trained by the Russian army, as well as the leaders, Kim Il-sung, the Korean people were, in North Korea, were deeply indoctrinated in the ideology and the practices of the communist state. The idea of socialism, the idea of a top-down administration, the idea of servitude of the people towards the party line, and also subjected to a very sophisticated and persistent form of indoctrination. So the North Korean people become indoctrinated to the top-down authoritarian regime and the method of running a country where you have absolute authority over everybody. And that then becomes the culture of North Korea, which it's still the same. We're now sitting looking at the product, the end product of a leader who gets away with being an absolute dictator of a nation. And a person who doesn't really spend a lot of time thinking deeply about the average welfare of the average person in the country, given the vast differences in the standard of living between the North and the South. Now, in the midst of all that, this is an important issue to talk about, because the Soviet Union had a very tentative sense of what degree to which they would engage the North. They have this, on the one hand, it's great to have hegemony over more land. It expands the sphere of communist influence. But on the other hand, it's a burden. It's something you've got to govern. It's something you have to devote their own resources to working with. And the Russians don't have time for that right now. Because what are the Russians busy doing? Let's use Berlin as an example. What happens to Berlin after the war? It becomes divided. There's an eastern sector. Other nations are now supposedly, under the Yalta and the Potsdam Agreement, supposed to be released around 5 years after the war to become democracies. While most of the Western nations, when the British, the French, and the United States now release, their control over these blocks, we did introduce democratic government, and we left.
We didn't leave, we left our troops there.
Well, but we didn't run the government.
Right.
We didn't dominate the politics of the organization, of the locales. What do the Russians do? Do they leave? No, they absorb those countries into satellite nations. Nations that are heretofore going to be beholden to Moscow, expanding the Soviet bloc. That's what they're doing. And they're further deepening the hold of the communist governmental ideology and control that they want. But what they're finding is that they're also recovering from a war. They're economically stressed. It was a long, hard war and costly war to fight. They were on our side, they were our allies. But they're worn out. So what they don't see Korea as something that they can do much about. They're not terribly interested in devoting yet more resources to developing Korea. They're much more interested in the Eastern Bloc, which is much more adjacent to where they are. And also an important buffer between them and the other parts of the West. So diplomatically, they make a decision. We'll try to maintain some presence, some allegiance, but we're not really ready to put a significant number of troops on the ground. But there's another issue that's going on. I think this is a background you need to understand. It's a little bit confusing. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. You know what? I've got to go through these. I'm going to get back to the United Nations discussion in about 2 or 3 slides. I have to get through this one. I should have put it a little bit later. What happens is in June 1st, excuse me. June 25th, 1950, the Kim Il-sung had succeeded, because of his thorough training with the Russian army, is able to develop a very powerful, well-trained, skilled, and motivated military force, twice as big as what the South Koreans have. And he decides, and both, by the way, both sides, oh, you know what I didn't do? Excuse me, I apologize. I didn't talk about Syngman Rhee. While Kim Il-sung is appointed as the commander, the dictator of North Korea, Syngman Rhee is placed in South Korea as the democratically elected leader that is chosen by the Americans. Now, Syngman Rhee is a person who's been in this country 25 years. He's a graduate of Princeton, and he goes to other universities. He's a thoroughly Americanized person. So that would be diplomatically an interesting choice for us, to have somebody who is well-trained in American ideology and democracy. Let's make him, or let's find a way to make him the leader in South Korea. Now, what I'm not sure, and this is every once in a while, no, not every once in a while, every lot of the while, there's something I don't know. I was too late last night to look it up. Does anybody know, did South Korea have an election for Syngman Rhee, or was it something that was imposed from the top by the Americans? Anybody know that? It was the one last fact check that I just didn't quite get to. I had to get to sleep. So the answer here, I don't know exactly what's going to happen. I'm going to check it out when I get home. I don't know if it was a manipulation, if it was one of those political things that was maybe a few people voted, or maybe it was a rigged election, whatever. The point is, however it happened, he becomes the leader of South Korea. Now, his problem is he is not democratically predisposed. He's a dictatorial, arbitrary leader who doesn't really see any need to have any kind of a process in policy making. It's all about he being the commander, which is not what the point of this was supposed to be. But it turns out he's as much a dictator as Kim Il-sung is in the North. He would like to someday, sooner rather than later, attack North Korea and gain control over all of Korea. And Kim Il-sung is at the same time saying the thing about him. We have two leaders who are interested in attacking the other side, either the north side or the south side. Because there is a desire, and in some ways on all of them, to unite Korea again as it was before. There is that natural national interest in doing that, because they got split up arbitrarily by treaties made in other places. So I still want to get that out of the way. So what we have here is an American-supported leader and a Soviet-supported leader, both of whom want to attack each other. So in effect, what we have is they become proxies for the foreign policy of the nations that placed them there, which is a problem we've been facing for a while, ever since then. All right, let's talk about the United Nations. Don't I get that out of the way? Then you get the invasion of June 25th, this surprise invasion from the north of 100,000 North Koreans, very well trained, motivated. North Koreans are trained to fight in a different way than Americans. North Koreans, and Chinese for that matter, are trained to live off the land or themselves. They'll travel with little packets around their belt of a little packet of cheese, of rice every day, with other packets of dried meat. And they can fight and move and maneuver without having a mess truck following them like Americans do. I'm exaggerating, we have K rations. But the point is, Americans are much more used to having something nearby to be fed with than the Koreans were. They require very little logistical support as far as nutrition and everyday needs of life. And they also tend to, when they fight and move, they don't move in one linear direction in say, a sort of a parade down a road. They tend to come through the trees in the mountains. They infiltrate that way. In fact, they do very unusual things. They'll set off flares at night all over the place, which spooks the Americans. They don't know what's going on. They use all sorts of what now we call psychological warfare. They do things that frighten their enemy and create on their enemy a perception that there are actually more of them than there are, although there's plenty of them. But they create an impression that there's just a huge number, and it's very intimidating. But also, tactically, they don't do frontal attacks. They don't meet in a football field, line up, and let's go at each other like it did in the First World War. It's not like that. They tend to do ambushes, attacks from various flanks. Or, you know what, let's just ignore this group and go around them. We'll infiltrate them and move on. All sorts of unconventional methodologies of moving and fighting that the Americans are not to understand, not trained to deal with. So that's this kind of asymmetric warfare that we deal with. And also there are large numbers, which makes it even harder. Well, that surprise invasion forces a very, very important issue, was how are we going to handle this? We do have an initial battle. It was a sort of a, what most military organizations do when they face a new enemy is they often try a probe of the enemy to see what their capacity is, to get a sense of what are we going to be dealing with in the future. So they sent out a task force Smith, which is a place about 30 miles southeast of Seoul, after Seoul has been run over. And there they encounter their first North Korean military organization, and they get routed. What they run into is T-30 Russian tanks, big, sophisticated, powerful tanks. The Russians actually gave the North Korean army 150 of them. Meanwhile, we have bazookas. We're trying to stop these very large, high-capacity tanks with bazookas, and our shells bounce right off. Just has no impact. And basically what the task force Smith does is it turns around and drops their weapons and runs. We just ran and disappeared into the woods because we knew we couldn't handle it.
Are
So
these South Koreans or the 500 Americans?
we're past the 500 Americans. Now we have a regular Army force. And the task force Smith is part of the 26th Division that's sent in as a probe. And there's about 580 of them. They're not the same 500 that were helping him. A lot of those were diplomatic people, not necessarily soldiers. So they get clobbered. It's an embarrassment. And that's when we realize that we have a serious problem. So what we then do, and this is the part I want to talk a little bit about, is I want to talk about the issue of the United Nations. Here's a picture of the refugees. We make these tactical mistakes. This is something that the South Korean army did. They were so frightened that they decided to bomb the most important bridge across the Han River south of Seoul. Unfortunately, they did it too fast and didn't wait long enough to let the people of Seoul cross the bridge. Thousands of people who were refugees from Seoul were on the bridge when it was destroyed by their own fellow soldiers in a panicked attempt to get away from the oncoming North Korean army. So now we decide, okay, we have now to test the ability of the United Nations to deal with this. So the UN Security Council is called into place, and it passes Resolution 83, 84, and 85. In the meantime, for the entire time when this was being discussed, this resolution, who was not there? Russia. Remember, there are 5 permanent members of the Security Council: France, England, Russia, United States, and China. Those are the 5. By the United Nations Charter, if any one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council vetoes a resolution, it does not pass, right? That's how. Then there are 7 more countries that are non-permanent. They're rotating people, okay? And they have a vote. But if one of the 5 votes no, it doesn't happen. We just had that happen 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
What happened 2 weeks ago?
The United States on the Israeli vote.
The Americans didn't vote against the resolution, but voted absent, which is the same thing as voting for it.
Right.
We could have stopped it, but we didn't. I don't want to get into that discussion here. It's too complicated. The point is, the Russians, in a peak of anger, was boycotting the United Nations. Why? Why were they boycotting the United Nations? Anybody know? Because, remember now, what was going on, what had just happened in China? The completion of what war? Or what? The Chinese Civil War under Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong, the Chinese army, basically completed its hegemony of China, and a lot of the nationalist Chinese under Chiang Kai-shek had migrated to a very important place called what? Taiwan. Okay? So they were, in the whole big discussion, if I remember when I was a newspaper boy, reading articles about this, was Taiwan going to be a country accepted by the United States as a legitimate member of the United Nations? That was a big fight. It still is a big fight in some circles. Russians were very upset that the United States was not condemning and not rejecting and having to do with Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalist army who had gone into Taiwan. Because the Chinese felt then and feel now that they legitimately won the revolution. They legitimately gained hegemony of all of China. They have no business in Formosa, Taiwan, it's called one or the other. And that Formosa and Taiwan rightly should be part of communist China under Mao. So there's a debate there. The Soviet Union does not agree with this. The Soviet Union's way of demonstrating its anger and frustration and disagreement with this policy is to not show up, to basically implicitly voting absent by not being there. As a result, the one entity that could have stopped American involvement in Korea would have been the Russians, who had, if they had rejected the Article 83, 84, 85. Article 83 is first, let's declare the fact that there's a problem and we need immediate cessation of conflict. That there's a threat to peace and prosperity. That was in the United Nations Charter, which they have a right to do. The second one is to now provide the member nations with I can't say permission, it's the wrong word, with the support, not authority, so not quite that, the support to make a recommendation that military action take place. And that, in that case, we will use the resources of the United Nations to support it. So the 4 other nations and about 9 other nations joined in a coalition allied forces of the UN, to form, from now on, not an American army, a UN army, a UN military organization to solve this problem. So it's under the umbrella of the United Nations, which makes it a lot easier for the American president to get the support of the American people, as happened in first Iraq War, and has happened recently, somewhere else, I can't think. All right. Now, one of the important issues you need to understand all throughout this is that, just remember that this, as you look at the United Nations, no matter where they're involved, as a practical matter, the Security Council has never ordered or required states to use force. They can recommend, but they don't use force. Thus, the US president has never been legally obligated to execute the UN Charter by committing US forces to combat a specific case. In all cases, in this country, the Constitution can trump any UN resolution. Keep that in mind. That the United Nations cannot force an American president to violate his or her own Constitution. So that's the dilemma here. That it's not as simple, oh, the UN has recommended us to go into action, but we have a choice about it. We still have to have a war powers agreement resolution in the United States Congress to support the UN resolution. Okay? That's critical. So that infects or drives the policy in a lot of ways. Because an American president has to be very careful about having significant support for his action. Now, the problem with Korea was, did Truman have the support of the American people? Let's talk about that a little bit. Think of when this is. What's the time? What's the era? 1950. What did we just get through? Two big things. Before that, we got through a depression. We fought our way through depression. We had 10 years in the 30s of a horrible depression, a lot of suffering, a lot of issues economically with people, job loss and so forth. Now we go to war. The war creates its own problems, death of thousands of American men, disruption of our culture, reorganization of our priorities. You can't buy a car, you have ration stamps, all that sort of thing. Okay. But here's the good news. The war did two things. What did it do? Two good things. It ended the Depression by creating what some economists call military Keynesianism. Now, I'm not going to get into the weeds of whether you believe or whether you don't believe in Keynesian stimulation. That's a whole big discussion, and you can go to MIT for that one, because they're still fighting over there. But that's kind of the assumption. But now, what comes with this issue? Very good. Which is another form of stimulus package. That's another stimulus package.
What is it?
The GI Bill. Okay. Now, we are now sitting in the nexus of the GI Bill positive force. Right here, Lexington is the center. 128, High Tech, Raytheon, DEC, all those companies that surround 128. What happened here? Who wanted to live in all the people from Somerville, Medford, who want to come and live in your town to buy a nice little house with the money they're making and a good job and an engineering outfit in Raytheon. It all works, doesn't it? Based on a free education that I got, thank you, from the federal government. And I also bought the house in my little development in Lexington. Or there's a nice one in Kelwyn Manor in Arlington. It's classic. These nice little capes. FHA loan, no interest, and supported by the Federal Housing Administration. So that's another, all these stimulus programs piled one on top of another is fueling the greatest boom in the history of mankind. The US GDP growth from 1945 to 1965 was exactly 3.0 to 3.1, exactly, for 30 years. Do the numbers. Now, if you do that, if you're at all mathematically inclined and do the wonders of compound interest, 3.13% interest every year for 30 years is a boom. It's a boom that lets people in this town and around, within 128, to buy a nice house, to raise a family, and to send those kids to college. It's the American dream. Okay? So keep that in mind. Now, in the face of that, I'm a family. It's 1950. We're just getting going. I just finished Northeastern University, my degree, my EE degree from Northeastern or MIT or wherever I've gone. And I just landed my first job at Raytheon in 128, and I got a nice Chevy in Fairlane, and I'm going to Hampton Beach for 2 weeks on vacation, and everything's good. Do I want to go to 40 degree below zero Korea? How's that for putting it in human terms, right? What is the appetite for doing that? There is no appetite. Very little. So that's a dilemma we have. So what do? We go into massive collective denial. Oh yeah. It's too bad. We get this little dilemma. Let's get it done quick. We don't want to know much about it. But here's what's interesting. Here's another mega number. It's not funny. It's a serious business. The way we acquire our troops in the Korean War is two ways: the draft and volunteerism. 1.5 million American men, some women, but mostly men. Well, women aren't drafted, just men are drafted, right? We're drafted. Already? Okay. Okay, we need to go to war. Okay, real quick, what did I just say?
Draft.
Draft. Okay, 1.5 million Americans are drafted, 1.3 are volunteers. That equals 2.7 million. 2.7 million Americans are now boots on the ground in Korea. At the height of the First World War, the AEF had about the same amount of men on the boots on the ground in France. That the level of involvement on the part of soldiers in America is almost the same as it was in France at the end of the war in 1918. That's to make the point of how large this commitment is. Okay, I gotta move on. All right, I think I already talked about that. Now, here's Task Force Smith, July 5th, which was a rout, which sent shockwaves through the military establishment about how ill-prepared we are to face what is a very powerful North Korean army. And then we decide, we create the parallel. One of the things that occurs in the United Nations is we draw a line, the 38th parallel, to divide North Korea and South Korea roughly. Turns out it was two low-level lieutenants at some task force who took a map and folded it and said, there's a 38th parallel, there's the fold, that's what we'll do. There's no rational reason for that. It was just, it fit nicely on a fold of a map. Advanced thinking. And also we do something which we have a tendency to do sometimes. Because we get involved, let's make sure that the Chinese don't get involved, and let's start bombing Zhongjin, which is way to the north of North Korea, very close to Russia, as a way of signaling to the Chinese that we're not interested in their coming here. All right? We're not interested in their coming here. One way of discouraging them from thinking that they might want to be involved. But the other thing that creates is this problem. Is we know from the strategic bombing surveys after the Second World War, is often bombing innocent civilian populations. You don't help your war effort, you aggravate it. You create more support for the war than was ever there before. That's a common backlash of indiscriminate bombings. It is all these horrible pictures that come out of it that confuse people, confuse Americans, confuse people in North Korea. And these are some pictures from North Korea of bombing in Chongjin. All right, then what the next strategic thing is, because the North Korean army moves so fast and so quickly without any resistance from the Americans or the South Korean army, we are having to push all the way down to the Pusan Peninsula at the lower southern end of Korea. In fact, this had all the potential of becoming another example of what happened to the British when they got caught in Dunkirk. This was a Dunkirk in the making. But it didn't quite happen. We were able, through some quick action on the American army and military, to bring some, very, very quickly, around 180,000 troops to come to the Punan Peninsula and set up a perimeter so we wouldn't be driven into the water and having to be left the peninsula altogether. That was a very important turnaround. It was a last gasp turnaround that enabled us to prepare ourselves for a counterattack. So now we have, this is I was going to spend 10 minutes on this, I can't. It worked. We managed to get 180,000 troops in here. We managed to set up a strong perimeter. A lot of it is on one side of a river, and then push back against the North Koreans, who are by now fairly extended, fairly tired, fairly easy to push back on. And we managed to maintain a toehold in the southern part of Korea. In the meantime, we have to do something to stop, to end the problem altogether. So this is when we decide to try a very tricky and a very high-risk strategy designed by Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur says, why don't we do an Incheon landing? Incheon is right here, just near Seoul. By now, almost the entire North Korean army is now well into the center or the south of the South Korean peninsula. Let's attack Incheon Harbor, move troops across the top and down, and trap them between the 180,000 here and the several divisions in the north, and basically enclose them on both sides, and trap them, and stop the war right there. Now, that plan was bold, imaginative, and it would be really good if it worked. But the chance of it working, according to some military prognosticators, particularly the Chief of Staff, particularly Omar Bradley's, it's about a 1 in 200 chance of working. So McCarthy's response to that is, in his typical flamboyant, sometimes cocky, arrogant way, well, good. If it's 200 to 1, we know that the Koreans won't defend against it, because they know how to count too. They know what strategy is. Certainly if they think it's 1 in 200, they're not going to put any troops around Incheon Harbor to prevent it, right?
Sure.
I don't know. Okay, well, that's his thinking. But he's willing to put the dice down. He's willing to take the risk. So he does. The problem with Incheon Harbor is it is very risky because it has one of the highest tides in the world. So when it's high, it's terrific. But when it's low, it's too low for the average draft of a typical military landing craft or a destroyer or a troop ship. So you get grounded. If you get grounded and you have enough troops in the surrounding islands, you're a sitting duck. It'll be a major failure. He tries it. Some of the ships get grounded, but most of them get through, just in time. They just happen to get there at the exactly right high tide position within several hours, unload the troops, and they move in and they recapture Seoul, which is nearby, with almost no resistance from the North Koreans. Because the North Koreans were using the same probability mathematics as MacArthur was, but it was working in his benefit. So what happens now is MacArthur's stock in trade, MacArthur's popularity soars through the ceiling. He becomes the great military genius, the great risk taker, the bold leader who moves the agenda and acquires a significant and important strategic benefit. And he does. And for a while, everything's looking really good. MacArthur's a hero. We, the Americans, have solved the big problem. We've recaptured Seoul. Now we can drive the Red Army, not the Red Army, excuse me, the North Korean army out. Well, so now what happens?
While overlooking the Han River and Seoul,
Here's a
the
little-
captured capital of South Korea,
Some
General
little footage of
Douglas
this.
MacArthur, the U.S. Commander-in-Chief Far East, created an audacious plan to defeat the communist North Korean forces.
If I only had the 1st Marine Division under my command again, I would land them here and cut the North Korean armies from their logistic support and cause their withdrawal and annihilation.
General MacArthur's vision of Operation Chromite, a decisive counterattack by the Marines, an in-run that would set up the destruction of the North Korean army, was met with serious doubts. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Omar N. Bradley.
That would be the riskiest military proposal I ever heard of.
Aware that the Joint Chiefs of Staff had recently ordered the amphibious-ly trained 1st Marine Division to Korea, MacArthur pressed on with his plans. Worried about the risk of an amphibious landing at Incheon, President Truman sent 2 members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to Tokyo to meet with MacArthur and propose a shorter, more conservative in-run. No Marines were invited to this top-level conference. The critical task of representing both the Navy and the Marines' vital interests fell to the prospective amphibious task force commander, Rear Admiral James Doyle. As the Navy's expert on amphibious operations, Rear Admiral Doyle sought to warn MacArthur of the daunting risks and obstacles associated with a landing at Incheon, and to propose an alternate, closer, and safer amphibious objective.
The amphibious landing is the most powerful tool we have.
Yes, sir, it is. But any amphibious landing is an operation of many details, interlocking and interdependent, each of which has to be performed successfully or risk jeopardizing the entire operation.
I realize that Incheon is a 5,000 to 1 gamble. I'm used to taking such odds.
As my staff will show, a thorough examination must be made of the enormous tactical hazards.
We drew up a list of every natural and geographic handicap, and Incheon had them all. The worst thing is the range of the tides. It's one of the most dramatic on the planet.
But an LST drafts at least 29 feet, and its speed tops out at 8 knots.
Looking at this part of the approach channel, that's not even enough room to turn a ship around in. God forbid one was hit and foundering.
The tide will only allow 2 to 3 hours to get in. Then they would be stranded with only 27 minutes of daylight to secure themselves against a city the size of Omaha.
Commander, you have taught me all I ever dreamed of knowing about tides. My confidence in the Navy is complete. And in fact, I seem to have more confidence in the Navy than the Navy has in itself. The Navy's rich experience in staging numerous amphibious landings under my command in the Pacific and the Lake never thought the day would come that the Navy would be unable to support the Army in its operations.
There are no real beaches, and the seawalls of the harbor are completely commanded by the gun emplacements on Wolverine Island. It would be almost impossible to achieve the element of surprise.
The very arguments you have made as to the impracticalities involved will tend to ensure for me the element of surprise, for the enemy commander will reason that no one would be so brash as to make such an attempt.
While all of the senior commanders in the room and in Washington agreed to the need for a major amphibious landing behind the Pusan perimeter to break the North Korean siege, they believed Incheon to be too great a reach, too great a risk. Army Chief of Staff General Lawton Collins.
And down here at Kunsan, the conditions are favorable to a landing. From a beachhead there, the troops will be positioned to strike at the enemy's
It would
rear.
be an attempted envelopment which would not envelop. It would not sever or destroy the enemy's supply lines or distribution centers, and therefore would serve little purpose. The only alternative to such as I propose will be the continuation of the savage sacrifice we are making at Kunsan, but no hope will leave Kunsan. Are you content to let our troops stay in the bloody perimeter like beef cattle in the slaughterhouse? Who will take responsibility for such a thing? Certainly I will not. Gentlemen, your viewpoints have been magnificent, and I respect them highly. However, I am the responsible commander, and will take the responsibility. We shall land in Incheon, and I shall crush it.
Moments after this, Lieutenant Colonel threw himself on a live hand grenade and saved the lives of several of his fellow Marines. Lieutenant Lopez was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions. It took the Marines less than 12 hours to capture Incheon. In 12 more days of intense urban fighting, Korean forces captured the capital, Seoul. 421 Marines and another 2,029 suffered wounds in the amphibious siege of Incheon and the liberation of Seoul. It was one of the classic amphibious assaults in the history of warfare.
Okay, now Truman decides to meet with MacArthur. It was a fairly cordial meeting, the first meeting. Truman was concerned. He was concerned about the risks he were taking, but it was well done. And basically, he exerts a promise from MacArthur. Okay, now, MacArthur is all revved up. He sees future great benefits of this. What does he have his eye on?
Presidency.
He wants to cross the Yalu and go into China. He wants to, same as you've heard, Patton had the same idea in Western Europe. He wanted to go to Moscow. So he starts having, yet again, his tendency to have large ideas and to have a lot of ego and a lot of way of ending his career in this vast masterstroke to finally put an end to the threat of communism. And Truman says, no, 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 that's not going to work. You're not going to get my support. You have to promise me when you're not going to cross the Yalu. No problem, Mr. President. We're not going to do that. He wasn't serious about his promise. So now the tide turns towards the Allies. Now the Allies move north. We have a strategy of a two-point strategy. You cross Seoul. First you go across 30th parallel. You liberate Pyongyang. Then you move your troops. You don't liberate them. You take over Pyongyang. Excuse me. That's the enemy. You have a two-pronged attack. You have the 8th Army moving north toward the Yalu River, and you also have the 1st Marine Division. Is that what you are in? Okay, the 1st Marines up through up to the Chosin Reservoir, which is where it's 40 below zero, very cold, getting toward the end of the year. But and also, once they do this, they'll all come together. Once they get past the Pusan Reservoir, the 1st Marines and the 8th Army meet and cross the Yalu into China. That's what he's really seriously thinking. It's hard to believe, but he's thinking about that. Because He's been the commander in the Pacific for all these years, and he's basically the president of the Pacific. That the president of the United States, they come and they go, but I've been here all along, and so far I've done everything right. All right, some of you people who are government bureaucrats know that. Yeah, the boss, they come, they go, but we move on. So now we have U.S. troops being prepared without the chiefs of staffs being asked about this. We're now preparing them to cross the Yalu, getting ready. For crossing the Yalu is a serious issue. And I was talking to Linda today. We were reading some of the same material, and she reminded me that the Chinese actually, through intermediaries and through diplomatic back channels, actually warned the United States that, no, if you cross the Yalu, there'll be pushback. We're not going to allow it. We're not going to have it. 3 of those happened. 3 of those didn't make it all the way to the top. And certainly if they did, General McCarthy didn't pay attention to it. He was bound and determined to sort of, you know, why don't you make the facts on the ground first. Once you have the facts on the ground, then it's hard for the politicians to reject it. If we cross the Yalu and damage and destabilize the Red Army, well, they're not going to ask us to leave because it's already a fact on the ground. That's a classic, you know, do it now and ask permission later kind of thing. And that's kind of how he's operating. So now we have this. Now we have something that we didn't see coming. This is a classic example of both hubris and bad intelligence. It's a mixture of the two. The assumption, oh, we can cross the Yalu and they're all going to fall down. There was an assumption by the American commanders, like one in particular was Lemon, your boss, right? General Lemon, who used to call the Chinese what?
Laundrymen.
Laundrymen. They're a bunch of laundrymen. Don't worry about those Chinese soldiers. They're laundrymen. We'll walk over them. These are people who spent 5 years fighting in the revolution. Tough fighters, right? You saw them. All right? So now we move north in this two-pronged approach. And guess what? Surprise attack. There are 130,000 Chinese sitting on the border that we didn't kind of know about. Or if we did, we were in denial about it, who crossed the Yalu before we even get there. Well, we've got a problem. The Great March to Victory is very quickly and unexpectedly stopped. So here's a kind of a summary. This is the kind of thing you get out of CNN, you know, one of those little CNN reports, like a bunch of tweets. This is what follows here, make believe, are 7 tweets about MacArthur's behavior, all right? Put out by Harry Truman or anybody. November 1st, he did not know whether his troops encountered Chinese troops. There had been some encounters, but well, not really, he didn't believe it. November 2nd, he admitted that there were Chinese in Korea, and they posed a serious proximate threat. The tweet, now it changes. Does this sound familiar? November 4th, never mind, he concluded that the Chinese were in country in size and strength enough to threaten the ultimate destruction of my command. Get the my command piece? No, it's not about my country, the Koreans, or the foreign policy issues. It's, I will go down with my command, having been destroyed. It's the classic kind of narcissistic behavior of an aging general who doesn't have it all together anymore. November 5th. He claims the battle a UN victory in the world will send you. Oops, what happened here? What happened? Hit the wrong button. Okay, we'll have to go. I'm sorry, I got to go through this again. Tweet number 5. He claims the battle a UN victory and urged the world to censure the Chinese government. Let's just claim it a victory, right? We've heard that, right? November 6th, he announced that his troops would continue pushing north toward Yalu. And then November 7th, upon seeing reports that more Chinese were crossing the Yalu, he ordered them bombed. Washington ordered him to rescind the order. That's the end of it. No, you're not bombing Chinese troops on the other side of the Yalu, period. We've already been warned 3 times that if you do, we're going to go down in greater numbers, and we're going to treat it as an act of war. This is the kind of mindset that had been created where he was no longer in control of his messages and his strategy. And it was a disaster. And then he says, he announces we'll be home the home by Christmas UN offensive, remember that one? Did you get home by Christmas? I don't think so. All right. And then ensues one of the toughest battles ever, and that's the chosen reservoir retreat. This is tragic. The 1st Marine Division, about 25,000 men, who were caught moving very slowly under Colonel Smith, right? General Smith.
General Smith.
Who was being told by General Lemon, who is a protege of McCarthy, who himself wants to cross the Yalu, because he wants the whole thing to work, and he'll then claim the reflected glory from MacArthur, and now be the new General MacArthur. He's an ambitious man, Lemon. And he's the one who says to Kid Smith, you're not moving fast enough up that narrow road through the valleys and ravines, getting up to the chosen reservoir, right? And you're being pushed and pushed. Go ahead.
General Almond.
Almond. What did I say? Almond. Yeah, just like something you eat, an almond. And General Almond is very arrogant, but very motivated, ambitious, and he sees glory coming if he works with MacArthur and going across the Yalu. Can't push Smith any further. They're dying on the vine. They're being ambushed in the ravines. There are approximately at least 5 communist divisions to every one of yours. You're outnumbered by a factor of 5. And they're all in the woods and the ravines, making life miserable for you. Okay?
And white uniforms too, in the
Right.
snow.
Right. So here we have an impossible situation. So what the General Smith says, no, enough. We're going to retreat. And what happens is the most embarrassing. The 1st Marine is a hallowed, storied division. It had a great record in the Second World War. And now they're having to face the humiliation of a painful, difficult, costly retreat, which is a black mark on the American military tradition. There it is, a frozen chosen. In fact, there was a lady reporter there. I gave Linda the book. A very interesting woman who was a reporter, who, by the way, let me just read what she says in her writing. She wrote a really nice book about all this in her career as the first embedded woman female reporter in American history. Many men were near collapse. Some died days like men who had accepted death and then found themselves alive after all. Half a dozen shivering Marine officers, their eyes and noses watery with cool, huddled around the fat tent stove for warmth. It was 15 degrees below zero. We were listening to a tall, rangy man, Raymond Murray, commanding officer of the 5th Marine Regiment, one of the Corps' most illustrious fighting units. Murray's words had a strange, unreal quality, for what he was saying was that the Marines were in retreat. Nothing like this, he explained with some wonder in his voice, had ever happened to the Marines before. This is, yes?
General Allen called it an advance to the rear.
It's an advance to the rear. Yeah, that's newspeak. Orderly retrograde, how's that? Like that one? Okay, here's some reports of chosen.
So the decision then,
5
which had
minutes.
been made by MacArthur
There you go.
to do the
We'll
inshore
make it.
landing, which was to get behind the North Koreans and cut them off. The decision was good. He wanted to get behind them,
We could just
and
get
he
through
did.
this one. That's the last big
Within a
battle.
matter of days, we recaptured Seoul. The decision then was made that he wanted to do similar. He wanted to backload the Marine Division, take them around the south, up to Wonsan, and cut across the country and go up to the Yalu River. When the 1st Marine Division landed at Wonsan, we started moving north. There was the 8th Army on the west and the 10th Corps on the east. The objectives of both were to get to the Yalu River. But the unit that went up into the chosen was the 1st Marine Division.
There's a way of leaving us.
We were put aboard trucks, a whole convoy of 6 bodies, and we go up about 15 miles to a little town called Sudan Meat.
In Sudan, they notified MacArthur that the Chinese are in the war, and of course he wouldn't believe that the Chinese were in. They're just volunteers, and he had an idea that somehow the being American was such that they wouldn't think of fighting the Americans. And he had a guy, the general under him, General Ahmed, who used to refer to the Chinamen as laundrymen. You're not afraid of any laundrymen. It's amazing. They would be critical of the enemy like these people can't fight. And believe me, they could fight.
These Chinese that we're now fighting had fought in the Chinese Revolution, in the Chinese Civil War between the nationalists and the communists, and a lot of them had fought the Japanese during the Second War. So this was a well-trained, well-equipped man. And this were not a bunch of volunteers.
China did not want to have the United States on their southern border. They were dedicated to North Korea. They had been supplying them, and they didn't want North Korea to lose. They were truly afraid because MacArthur was so determined that he would continue to go on into China, across the Yalu River.
Okay. Now, I'm going to sort of wrap this up. We have the embarrassment of the retreat both of the 1st Marine Division and the 28th Army over in the east side, or west side. Neither are able to move forward. The Chinese communists now are moving down. They push the Americans past again, and for the second time sack Seoul, for the second time. It was an incredible embarrassment. They get about as far as maybe 30, 40 miles below the 38th parallel, and they run out of steam. They get tired, just like they've been fighting for quite a while. So Truman brings in Matthew Ridgway, a very strong, brilliant strategist, a leader, realizes that the Americans are demoralized. Were you demoralized?
We were looking for a new general.
Yeah, you were looking for a new general instead of this public relations guy. All right? You look, thank you. That's, ooh, I could have quote that. We're looking for a new general. I want to put that in my thing. I like it. It's very real. My person is there. Wow. Are you for sale? Can we come with that? Great. Yeah, they were tired. Ridgway comes along, introduces discipline, realistic modern fighting techniques, use of lights at night, use of various kinds of strategies, not just forward and front, but more decentralized strategies. Respects the troops, talks to them, listens to them. Oftentimes MacArthur's in Japan. Fighting the war, he's not in country. That's a problem, all right? And you know that. So he basically manages to regain the momentum, starts to push back. But here's the difference. When he starts to push back, he's now about a third of the way down the south, below the 38th parallel. He pushes back, crosses to the top, maybe about 10, 15 miles north of it, and says, okay, that's enough. I'm not going back to the Yalu. No more Yalu, that's done. We just want to stabilize the front. Kind of what happened after the first Battle of the Marne, there next to the Ain River, north of the Somme. Same strategy. So he stabilizes the front. And for the next about a year, there's a ding-dong back and forth. 30 miles below, 30 miles above. Back and forth, and finally both sides get tired because nobody's making any progress, and now settle for a ceasefire. That's a quick ending to that. Okay? You like that, huh? Yeah, sorry. Good. Bring my dancing shoes when I do this stuff. All right. I want to end in a way that I do all the time. I always do this everywhere I go. Is I want to play sincere tribute to the men and women who serve, suffer, die for their country. It's a general message about, and I do it everywhere I go. And I feel it's part of what I have to do. It's my sort of mission. Okay? So give me 1 minute to sort of find this, where this is, and I'll get you out of here in a minute. Oh, you're also patient. Okay, this is a song that is now often played by the United States Military Academy Choral Society at funerals at West Point. It's called Mansions of the Lord. And basically, it's somewhat of a religious piece, and I say that up front. I'm not pushing religion, but I think it's something that's important that some people relate to. So I will just play it. But I have a rendezvous with death at midnight in some flaming town, when spring trips north again this year, and I to my pledged word am true, I shall not fail that rendezvous. Thank you. Okay, I'll wait. Do you have any questions?
We welcome your questions, and you know, Korean War veterans, if you have questions, we'd love to have you go first.
Here's a question.
Yeah, all right. George, you had the honor. You can go first.
To that piece of information that you did not have at the beginning.
Yes, good.
Sigmund Rhee was in this country and very close to the military when the time came. He was brought to Korea by the military and made part of the legislature. I forget the term in South Korea. And then a little while later, he was elected president by the legislature in a vote over 90%.
Okay.
I think that was because of our military influence,
right.
But they elected him.
Okay.
He had one competitor. That competitor got less than 10%, and a bullet in the back of the head a little while later. And Sigmund Rhee is given credit for that.
Okay, I appreciate your answer. That's a good answer. It wasn't a popular election. It was a legislative election of the existing leaders,
right.
And one who opposed them got his reward later.
The other thing I'd like to comment on is that I'm not sure that everybody understands General MacArthur. And his father, he grew up with his father, a general in Asia. And he ended up his entire career in Asia, and he knew and understood the Asian mentality better than any other member of the U.S. military. And from that, no question, he had a bigger ego than almost anybody walking the earth. But because of that, he had a knowledge and understanding that meant that his decisions were based on a lifetime of affiliation in that part of the world. And so I think you have to give a lot of, I don't know,
Acknowledgement.
Acknowledgement that he had that kind of a base that he was working from.
And by the way, you should know, go ahead. You want to,
One, and then who had your hand?
Well, at what point did MacArthur decide to go into China, and when did he act to try to implement nuclear weapons in the war?
he never tried it, but he talked about it. But so did Truman. Truman was aware, while MacArthur is thinking, I may need some nuclear capacity here to stop the Chinese, Truman was saying, we may have to look at the nuclear weapon. They were both looking at it. One was a little more forceful about it, but Truman was not unaware of that. But between him and the chiefs of staff, they simply said, no, going to China, regardless of whether we're going to use nukes or not, is not appropriate. It's not in the best interest of the United States. And it's also, we're not going to win it. We don't have the will in the country doesn't support it, and he fires MacArthur. Now, we know, I was a kid back then, I remember, that was a tough decision because Truman's popularity went south, down to like 20% after he did that. He fired one of the greatest heroes in American history. And people were angry. And also, this is a complicated time. It was in the early 20s, 50s rather, when, if you remember, Joseph McCarthy was speaking from Washington and scaring people and creating the communist fear and the whole repressive environment he was creating. And that was building up. And Truman was feeling that, and Eisenhower really felt it. And they were feeling pressure from that lobby, that part of the American electorate, that they were really not altogether convinced that we shouldn't crush the communists. So Truman was in a mess, and his popularity went way down, but 30 years later, it's been almost completely restored. But, good point.
Next one is,
yes.
I have a question for you. I noticed that when you were talking about the Necton River.
Oh, yes.
I'd like to go back just a little bit.
Yeah.
In America here, every time we have a war, and we have a good army, it disappears. Now, I was in the second Infantry Division at Fort Lewis, Washington, when this war broke out. I got a phone call at night at about 10 o'clock to get all my troops back to the barracks. 7 days later, we were on board ship.
Mm-hmm.
Now, at that time, American Army units were about 50% at strength.
Right.
You indicated that in your...
Oh, yeah.
Now, we had about 50% of our company were regular Army.
Mm-hmm.
We had to pick up the balance of these people at a depot.
Right.
We got cooks, bakers, you name it, we got them. We boarded on a ship. We left it in 7 days for Korea. We trained these people on board the ship,
Mm-hmm.
and we landed at Busan.
Mm-hmm.
That was the end of July.
Okay.
The sad thing about all this, what I'm trying to tell you is, these same people that we got just picked up didn't last very long. We do the darn thing again, and we're doing it right now in America. We're reducing our people.
Okay.
And you never mentioned that. Now, the casualties in Korea on the Busan Peninsula was tremendous.
Listen, you know, the larger mega fact around what you're saying is that at the end of World War II, we had 12 million American soldiers who were deployed. It went from 12 million to 460,000 in a matter of about a year. It was a massive deflation and demobilization of the military. And that's what's happening because nobody saw Korea coming and nobody wanted to see Korea coming. It was half not knowing, half denying it when you did know. It's one of those historic dilemmas. But you're right, there was a huge de-escalation. And that's what and so, and also, the troops that came on the 28th Army, the 26th Division of the 28th Army, which fought, no, the 2nd Division, excuse me. The 2nd Division was, a lot of them were in Japan. You know what they were doing in Japan? They were hanging around, they were drinking, having nice meals, and had girlfriends, and all. They were not ready for a street corner fight, never mind a war.
Well, the 2nd Division was not in Japan.
Oh, no, who was the one that came from Japan?
2nd Division was in Fort Lewis, Washington, and they're the ones that were.
Okay, so you're the ones you're talking about.
That's right.
All right, so this different one. But what I'm saying is, we were not sufficiently prepared, ready to fight with the equipment and have all the equipment there and the training that we needed to fight this war.
We didn't even have the equipment.
Right, we didn't have the equipment.
But the President of the United States sat there and our government sits there and they put these people knowingly that they're gonna be casualties. That's not right.
Right.
And we're doing it again today.
All right.